Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the first module in the current series of Lunch and Learn. I'm looking forward to working with you over the next several months, and a warm welcome if this is your first Lunch and Learn. I think most of the people in this series are new to this. Guys, if you're new to the whole process of webinars, well, first of all, congratulations for getting on board. But over on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's a little question box. And what I want to encourage you to do is to ask questions throughout the broadcast. So I don't want to wait to the end and sort of have nothing really to respond to. And really, when you've got a question, you probably want to ask it straight away. So all you do is open up that question box, type in your question. I'll keep an eye on it. And as soon as I see a question there or a comment or an observation, I'll stop and acknowledge it and address it. Now, you should be aware that I'm the only one that sees your question, although having said that, I'll read it out, obviously, for the other people in the broadcast so they can understand what the question is, and then I'll respond to it. So that's our way of making this as participatory as possible. You could probably understand I can't unmute everybody, because if I did that, we'd have all sorts of sound and distraction in the background. So if you could just keep that in mind as we go through, that would be great. And I do encourage you to make comment. Now, at the completion of this webinar today, you will receive a set of slides. So just relax. You don't need to take any notes or anything like that unless there's something really relevant you want to copy down. And you'll also receive a full recording. So you can download a YouTube video, or you could look at the slides, or both. So the beauty of this is that you can go and revise anything that might be useful for you. So that's the process. And then I will also make sure that I send out an email in between each session. And if you haven't already enrolled in each session, please do so, because if you don't enroll in each session, then it's likely you're going to miss out on updated emails and so forth. So unfortunately, you can't just enroll for the whole series. You've got to enroll for each module as we go, which is a very simple process, as you know. It's just a case of putting your first name in and your email address, and it's all done. And then you receive all the emails. So that's just a very simple process and discipline to keep in mind as we go through. And I would encourage you also, if you've got any comments about anything that you've tried, any success stories or any frustrations that you might have in relation to what you're trying, because obviously in between these sessions I'm going to give you some homework to do, which is not onerous, but it's very practical. It's things that you have to do, and you could probably imagine out of today's module, it'll be about feedback. And I'd like to hear what's going on, and that helps me to understand how you're implementing things. So you've got my email address there on the screen. So please send me emails in between sessions. That's part of the deal. All right, so let's move on, and let's have a look at the whole program, the program in its entirety. So what you notice here is that we've got 6 modules, and you might say to me, well, why did you pick these 6? Well, of course, I could probably select 50 modules that might be useful for you as a leader, but I think these are fundamental to leadership. And I obviously couldn't go on forever, and with 6 sessions, I thought, well, what would be the key things that any leader would want to know about or perhaps improve? And so that's really why the modules are as they are. So let me just give you a very brief overview of each, And then what will happen is we'll get stuck into module 1, which of course is about the ingredients of effective feedback. And that's what we'll do today, which I won't cover. But in module 2, and these are all spaced 2 weeks apart, we'll be looking at enhancing your personal influence. And the argument is, of course, that as a leader, you're actually in the business of influencing. You can't actually make anybody do something, but your job is to try to influence them to do something. And so that's a very important topic. And in order to do that, I'll be sending you a link, and that link will have an opportunity for you to complete an online diagnostic on your influencing capability profile. And you can download that. It's a 14-page profile, which I think you'll find very interesting. Certainly that's been the feedback from previous participants. And then what we'll do in module 2 is that I'll just debrief you on that so that I can explain to you the pros and cons of each of the 4 influencing styles, and perhaps look at ways that you can enhance your influence. In module 3, we'll look at optimizing team performance, and most of you would be leading teams, and if you're not, you will be at some point in time. A team could mean anything from basically 2 people to, 100 people, I guess. So it's about how do we get the best out of our teams, because critically important now that our hierarchies are breaking down and we're working more in team environments. In module 4, we'll look at getting the very best from people, and I would argue that that's one of your core responsibilities as a leader, is how do we get the very best from the people we lead. Now, that's always more difficult than it sounds, but I guess we're not trying to get people to be at optimum levels of performance necessarily, although that would be great. But how can we just increase their percentage or their performance percentage by, say, 10% or more? So I'm going to give you some reputable models around leadership, and I'm going to ask you to try these and come back and let me know how it goes. In module 5, there's another diagnostic, but this will be a paper version, and we'll be looking at understanding people and their personalities. And understanding people and their personalities really is about a framework, a convenient framework for you to be able to deal more effectively with the people that you deal with, because all of us have had personality clashes, or at the very least have found it difficult to understand where that person's coming from. So I think module 5 will be very useful for you. And in module 6, we're looking at facilitating effective meetings. Now, the fact of the matter is this is a meeting, albeit online, and when we finish this, you're probably into another meeting and another meeting and another, it goes on and on and on and on. So, and many of those meetings, of course, as a leader, you're expected to run. So I think becoming good at running meetings is essential. And if you become good at meetings, I can tell you this, you will stand out in the crowd, because we've all been to enough boring, unproductive meetings in our lifetime. And I think it's important for you to be able to facilitate effective meetings. And that's what Module 6 is about. You may not be in the position to do that now, but you certainly will be at some point in your career. And if you are, perhaps I can help you improve the quality of your meetings. So guys, that's pretty much the program. And I wonder if anyone's got any questions about content. If you can type that in now, that'd be great. Otherwise, if there's no questions, let's launch into module 1, which is, of course, about feedback. So there's a little delay while this comes up on your screen, and there it is. It's on your screen now. Let's have a look at this, this information, which is a good starting point to talk about feedback. Now, pretty straightforward research. You'll notice that the blue illustrates engaged employees and the red illustrates disengaged employees. And you'll notice that up the top in the first column, or over on the left-hand side, if people receive strength-based leadership strength-based feedback. In other words, you're talking about people's strengths, talking them up, talking about how they can utilize them more effectively in the current work and future work that they do. It's likely that you will have engaged employees. So if, in other words, you're going to give feedback, obviously the easiest feedback to give is strength-based feedback. So if somebody, for example, is good at dealing with customers and you notice them having a really good interaction with a customer, the feedback that you might give them after you have listened to the conversation might well be around how positive they are at dealing with that situation. So you'll obviously, that is, people like receiving that feedback as long as it's genuine, and you will ultimately have a greater likelihood of engaging people if you indulge in effective strength-based feedback. Now, if you only give critical feedback, in other words, what we might call negative feedback, interestingly enough, I suppose it's not interesting to know that you will have a less engaged workforce, but you'll still have a high level of engagement. So this is very interesting because if you look at the very last one there, it says if people feel that they're receiving no feedback at all, you can be sure that people will be disengaged. So in other words, what all this is saying is any feedback is better than no feedback. So what we're going to be doing in this module is look at ways of doing that effectively. So giving critical feedback is better than no feedback, and even better is giving critical when it's needed and also positive feedback when it's warranted. And if you do that, you're likely to engage people more so in the process. So keep that in mind as we go through the slides. That's my first point. All right, let's look at a couple of key things around feedback that's critically important. So the first key point here is that roughly by a 3-to-1 margin, employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve their performance than positive feedback. Interesting. So what people are saying basically is that maybe they mightn't like critical feedback, but they're saying that they need critical feedback. So pulling people up when they don't meet your crossbar or your standards is important. And interesting enough, employees acknowledge that it's important. So please continue to do it, or if you hesitate to do it, then I suggest you start doing it. Now, the secret to having employees listen to your feedback is whether or not they respect you. Now, the reality is respect and feedback go hand in hand. So you can give the most eloquent feedback imaginable, but if people actually don't respect you, that is, as a leader, not a person, but if they don't respect you, the feedback is likely to fall on deaf ears, whether it's positive or negative. So it's critically important that you're respected. Now, it's a little bit of a paradox because in order to become respected, you've got to give feedback. But in order for people to listen to that feedback, you need to be respected. And of course, as we know, respect is earned. It's incredibly hard to get, and it requires a degree of authenticity. And I'll talk a lot about authenticity as we go through the program as such. Excuse me. Okay. So you could have, for example, you could have exactly the same thing said to two different people, and you're likely to get two different responses or effects. And that's based on your working relationship with each person. So it's important to build up good, constructive working relationships with the people that you lead. And the law of averages suggests that perhaps if you have 5 people in your team, it's likely that one of those people or one of those relationships probably needs some work, and perhaps one of them is going really, really well, and there's 3 that are a work in progress but are adequate. So professional working relationships are critical, but as I said, it's a bit of a paradox, because if you're giving good feedback, it's likely that you're going to be building good working relationships, but in order to get in order for people to listen to that feedback, they need to feel that they're in a good working relationship with you. We'll talk more about that as we go through the Lunch and Learn series. All right, now one of my bugbears, I guess, are performance reviews, and I honestly don't believe that they're very effective. And sometimes that's the only feedback that employees get, is once a year or or twice a year, depending on how often you do this. And often what happens is managers will save up and store up all their feedback and give it during the performance review. And of course, the employee is completely blindsided. It's not a good way to go. What you've got on this very busy slide is a whole bunch of interesting statistics around what people think about performance reviews. So I just want to run through those with you, because it's a bit of an eye-opener as to how people react to performance reviews. So first of all, 30% of performance reviews end up decreasing employee performance. So that's pretty interesting, isn't it? So whilst the performance review is trying to increase performance, 3 out of 10 people are saying it actually decreases performance. And there's no evidence anywhere I've found in any of the research anywhere that actually shows definitively that performance reviews actually increase feedback. So I question why we're doing it, and have written a book about that called The End of the Performance Review. Anyway, 58% of executives believe their current program doesn't result in performance or engagement. 58%. So most people have got a dim view of the performance review and see it very much as a bureaucratic form-filling exercise. 70% of companies are now reconsidering their performance strategy. That's a lot. So your organisation may well be considering their performance reviews. I hope they are, or perhaps have done so and have done something about it. So there's a lot of companies out there that I deal with, and organisations that are now reviewing the review and looking at other ways of doing this more effectively. 2 out of 3 employees with the highest performance scores aren't actually the highest performers. So this is problematic, because we tend to give people scores and ratings often out of 5, a Likert scale. 3's average, 4's above average, 5 is outstanding, 2's below average, and 1 is woeful. Now, what often happens is that we don't want to rock the boat, so we give people scores, say in the mean area of, say, 3, when in actual fact it should be a 2 or a 4. So scores aren't always accurate, and certainly there's a perception amongst employees that those scores aren't truly reflective of performance, which suggests 2 things. One is either the scores are poorly administered, or that you're not giving, or someone's not giving feedback on why the score is the score, and doing it in a constructive way. 6% of companies surveyed think performance reviews are worth the time, which basically means that 94% of people think it's a waste of time. So the majority of people, whether they're the people on the receiving end, the people giving the performance reviews, or HR, if you throw everybody in, there's an overwhelming majority of people that don't think it's worth the time. 2% of HR executives say the yearly evaluations are useful. Only 2%. So that's 98% of people that don't see it as useful. 80% of workers are dissatisfied with their performance reviews. Incredible. 8 out of 10 people are dissatisfied with the way the reviews are administered. And 3 to 5% improvement in performance, all managers believe, will be generated in the process. So you can see that they're pretty stark statistics and probably suggest that we need to consider other means and ways of giving feedback rather than simply sitting down with someone once a year or twice a year. Now, you may have no choice. You may have to do that anyway. I'm suggesting that you give feedback regularly and in between these performance reviews so that by the time you get to the performance review, it's a fairly simple, stress-free approach. So worth thinking about, I'm sure. Okay, so guys, if you've got any questions, comments, observations, love to hear them. Now, one of the most important things in all of this is for you to manage your expectations of the people that you lead. Now, that might sound like a very simple statement and not a difficult concept. It is actually quite difficult. There are actually 7 questions that need to be answered in terms of you conveying and people accepting your expectations. Let's run through them, and it's quite important that you think carefully about which of these you may need to improve on. The first key question that needs to be asked, the fundamental question, is what are your expectations as a leader? Are you clear about the expectations you have of your people? That's the very first point. So you might say, yes, I do, but think carefully about that. Are you absolutely crystal clear about what you expect of the people you lead? Because fundamentally, that's the starting point, isn't it? Now, once you have been clear about your expectations, the next key question is, have I communicated these expectations to my team? Now, many managers I talk to say, yes, I have. And then when I go and talk to the employees, they say, no, he or she hasn't. Now, it may well be that you have, but it just means that you've got to do it persistently and consistently. So persistent means all the time, and consistently means not changing those expectations, making sure that they are consistent for everybody in your team. So have you communicated your expectations? The third key question in all of this is, do my team members understand those expectations? So it's one thing for you to communicate, but it's another thing that there's an understanding of what that actually means. So do they understand what you expect? And if they do understand what you expect of them, the next key question is, do they accept those expectations? So I do understand it, but I may not accept it. So I might as well not understand it if I don't accept it. In other words, I'm probably not going to meet your expectations because I don't accept that those expectations are reasonable for me or in this situation, or they're too high or they're unrealistic. So the next key question, question number 5, you've got to be able to respond to is, are my team members committed to meeting those expectations? So it's one thing understanding them, it's another thing accepting them, but the next question is, are they committed to meeting those expectations? And a lot of the reason that they would be is because they do accept them, or they think they're reasonable, or they have respect for you, or they meet them anyway, and it's just a matter of continuing to do what they do. But you need people's commitment in order to meet those expectations. Question number 6, do my team members know how they're performing against those expectations? And this, of course, goes to the heart of feedback. Are you giving regular, consistent and persistent feedback on those expectations so that people actually understand whether or not they're satisfying your expectations? And pretty much that's the heart of what we're doing here in this presentation. And next, am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? Am I removing roadblocks? Am I supporting them in terms of giving them encouragement? Am I training them? So obviously, if you don't support people, it's going to be more difficult for them to achieve what you expect of them to achieve. So you can see that it's a much more complex thing than just, you know, communicating your expectations. You need to know what they are. You need to communicate them. People need to understand them. People need to accept them. People need to commit to them. People need to know how they're performing against those expectations, and they need to feel that you're supporting them. So it's something that you might like to think about where in that process you might need to make some changes. Okay, any questions that people have got? Type them in the question box. I'm more than happy to stop and respond. All right, now what I want to do now, and this will come up on your screen very soon. There we go, disappeared, there it is. So let me talk about a couple of key fundamentals around giving feedback that are really important. And some of you might know these and might need to be reminded of them, and others this might be brand new. But nevertheless, these are all important fundamentals of giving feedback. Timing is critically important in feedback. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the sooner after a critical incident that you give the feedback, the better. The more likely it is for them to take on board your feedback, and the more likely it is for them to take your feedback seriously. And usually the feedback is done at the end of a critical incident, either positive or negative. What do I mean by that? Well, something that's happened, some behaviour that you've noticed, and you've decided to give feedback. Now, if you do it immediately after, what message are you sending the other person? Well, the message you're sending the other person is it's critically important, because if it's so important, in fact, that I'm willing to jump on it the moment after the behaviour has taken place. So that sends a really strong message, and it's more likely that people will accept your feedback on that basis. Now, just think about it this way. If you sat down in a performance review and you said to somebody, look, 6 months ago you gave a really great presentation in the team meeting. Do you remember that? And they say, yes. I just wanted to say to you that was great, and I thought it went over really, really well. Well, whilst it's probably better than nothing, I guess the person on the receiving end is thinking what? Well, they're thinking, if that was really that great, surely you would have found the time and opportunity to have told me that after the event and not saved it up for 6 months later. So you can see that timing's critical. Now, I know this is problematic because often we're all very busy people, let's face it. And the fact of the matter is, it may not be completely possible for you to give immediate feedback. Now, in those circumstances, you need to do this as quickly as possible. The longer you take, the less effective the feedback's going to be. So, sure, it might be next day, it might be the next couple of days, but if you're making excuses and putting it off, then all you're doing is making the whole process more difficult. And so I think it's really important to keep your eyes and ears open. And when you see something that's very positive, or when you see something that's not so positive, jump on it immediately and give people that feedback. So timing is critical. Principle number 2, be specific in your feedback. It's no good giving a generalized bit of feedback, because if you give generalized feedback, one, as it sounds a little bit insincere, and secondly, people may not actually know what your feedback is about, whether it's positive or negative. So it's really important to do that. Let me have a look at, let's talk about a couple of examples. All right, so if you think about this feedback. It's on your screen now. Here's some feedback that I've decided to give someone. I might say to them, overall, good job on the presentation at this morning's meeting, but it could have been better. So that's my feedback. Now that's too vague. So, what was wrong with it? I mean, the other person's probably going to be thinking to himself, well, what could be done better? And just because you didn't like it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. How could it have been better? So there's a number of things missing in that feedback. And so the person's going to walk away with more questions than answers based on that sort of feedback. Perhaps a better way of dealing with it would be this. Great job on the presentation. I really like how you use statistics to back up your key points. Okay? And then you might say, one small comment, maybe for next time, um, it, it would be better if you invite more comments from the group to get them more involved. You see how that's more effective? Because what I'm doing is I'm being more specific, and the person's actually walking away with some constructive criticism, and they're also walking away with what you actually liked about the presentation. So it wasn't just a generalized comment about how they dealt with the meeting. So what does that mean? It means you've got to just you've got to be thoughtful before you give the feedback and think about what you're going to say before you say it. And that becomes very useful. The third principle that's important is that you need to give frequent feedback. Frequent feedback means all the time, moment by moment, day by day, project by project, task by task, and on and on and on it goes. Feedback is never ending. Just because you give somebody some feedback once is not the end of the road. In fact, it's the start, because once you've given someone feedback, you are then in a very good position to follow that up at a later date to give them feedback on the feedback, if you like. So it's never ending. Now, I know we're all busy people, and you might say, well, I have a stack of things to do. I can't be sitting around giving feedback all day. Well, just think about this for a moment. The payoff is significant. People, as you saw from earlier statistics, want feedback. They need feedback. And it's important that you give feedback because they have an expectation that that's part of your job. So you really can't avoid it. In fact, it's one of the most important things that you can do in the workplace. And survey after survey shows that employees feel that they're not getting enough feedback. So what it means is that we need to take stock and make an effort to do more and more of it. Okay, the next principle that's critically important is for you during the feedback to ask questions. So feedback's not you making a whole bunch of statements. It's also about asking them for feedback on their own performance. And the best way to do that, of course, is to use open-ended questions. And the open-ended questions start with why, what, where, who, how, and which. If you start any question with any of those words, it's what we call an open-ended question. And in other words, it's likely to get more than a yes or no. So, for example, before you launch into giving someone feedback, why not just ask them and say, how do you think you went? How do you think you dealt with that customer? And then keep quiet and allow them to respond. And if their response is very similar to yours, then well and good. Then you can just elaborate on what they've said. If their response is quite different to the feedback that you would give them, then you can say, well, I've got some other feedback for you. So start by being dignified by asking them to give you feedback before you launch in and give your feedback. So your feedback should be filled with questions. So get good at asking questions. It becomes a fundamentally important leadership skill to be good at asking questions, and particularly, as I said, the open questions: why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. So questioning skills are critically important. Another principle that's really important is to give feedback privately. Now, I know that there's a saying out there that says, praise in public and criticize in private. I don't agree with that. I think all feedback should be done privately. Why? Well, there are some people that just don't like to be the center of attention in front of other people. they can get actually quite embarrassed if you draw attention to them in a meeting. So why not? It'll have the same impact, let me assure you, if you give it to them privately. So why not just pull them aside and say what you're going to say in front of everybody else anyway? It doesn't really concern anybody else. You're really giving that feedback. And of course, you can then make eye contact with them and they know it's very genuine. So I suggest to you that all feedback, wherever possible, should be done in private. Now, working in open office environments, as most of you do, it's not that easy, of course, because obviously if you give people feedback in an open office environment, it's everybody else in the office will know. So perhaps it might be useful to just ask the person if you can have a word with them. Go outside, find a meeting room, wherever you can in your own environment, so that you can give that feedback, um, privately. And it doesn't need to take very long. It can take 1 or 2 minutes and it'll make a huge difference. So it's not going to be impinging on your workload. Another key principle around giving feedback is to use what I call critical incidents to um, shape your feedback. So in other words, if you're observing people in the office or you've heard information or you've got an email or something, that's critical information. That's a critical incident. And some of those critical incidents are positive and some of those critical incidents are negative. So what you do is you build on that. That's your evidence. So you talk about that incident that occurred and you give feedback on that incident. Now, if you do, in other words, the opposite is to sort of say, look, every meeting that we're in, you're always negative. Now, that's not as effective as to say that this morning I just wanted to mention to you that during the meeting I noticed that you made 4 negative comments about other people's ideas. You see, that's far more effective because it's specific and it's based on a critical incident. And of course, it's hard to argue with that. Now, they might say, well, all I was doing was trying to be constructive. That may well be the case, but, it's hard to argue when you are drawing attention to an incident or a behaviour that's occurred in the workplace. All right, another principle that's critically important in giving feedback is to focus on the future. Now, obviously, the feedback is about shaping behaviour for the future. So this implies that there's no good complaining, whinging, or focusing too much on the past. We look at the critical incident in order to draw conclusions from it to allow us to be a more effective or change or modify our behaviour in the future. So the focus is on the future. So in other words, if someone wants to whinge and complain and talk about excuses and all those sorts of things, then you can politely tell them to stop and suggest to them that this is about the future and this is about ensuring that this doesn't happen again, or that perhaps it happens in a different way in the future. So it's all about the future. That's the only reason we're giving feedback, is to modify behaviour for the future. And that, I'm sure, would make sense to you. All right, changing focus now. So guys, if you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to respond. So just type them in the question box there. You're a very quiet bunch today, I can see. Maybe it'll take you a while to to warm up to the process. Okay, some guidelines on conversations on poor performance, because let's face it, conversations on poor performance aren't the easiest things in the world to do, and sometimes people avoid them, and because they avoid them, it doesn't mean they go away, and performance actually sometimes can get worse as a result of that. So let's have a look at a couple of key things that are important. So let's say that somebody's performing poorly, there's a critical incident that you can draw attention to, you've plucked up the courage to pull them aside in privacy, and you're going to give them that feedback. So here are a couple of things that you need to be aware of that are critically important. Firstly, when you pull somebody aside, because of you wanting to give them feedback, get straight to the point. There's no point in starting by chit-chat and small talk. The person's sitting there very anxious thinking, what in heaven's name is this all about? So they're sitting there wondering, and all that happens is the stress level rises while you're trying to put them at ease. It's not about necessarily putting them at ease. I don't want them to be terrified either, but the bottom line is that you need to get straight to the point. So you might preface the meeting by saying, the reason that I have pulled you offline is, okay? So you just get straight into it. This is not a time for small talk. Principle number 2, get straight, and this can go hand in hand with the first point, get straight to the point by explaining the purpose of the meeting. I wanted to talk to you about the way you interacted with that customer. All right, so get straight to the point so that really they're not sitting there wondering what is all this about, because the reality is some people don't actually know why you're pulling them up, and they probably are very anxious to know. So tell them, because if you don't tell them early on, they're going to be becoming more and more anxious during the particular conversation that you're having with them. Principle, or the third key point, is that once you've explained the purpose of the meeting and got straight to the point, bite your tongue until it bleeds. In other words, shut up and ask them what they thought of that situation or that critical incident or that encounter. What did you think about that? Because 1, it gives you a chance to catch your breath. 2, it's respectful to the other person to give them an opportunity to interact, because this should be a conversation, not you telling somebody off. And 3, obviously it would be of great interest to hear what they think about the critical incident anyway. So just get them to talk. And, it's really important, which is principle number 4, is you must not interrupt them. Now, this is easier said than done, because often people will say things that are actually false or provocative during their explanation. The important thing for you is to bite your tongue until it bleeds and hear them out. Now, why would I suggest that, even if they've said things that are inaccurate? Because very shortly after they've finished, you will want to say something, and you probably want them to listen wholeheartedly to what you have to say, and you can only do that really if you have not interrupted what they've said. So in fact, you can actually say to the person, now listen, I've given you a chance. I really need to say what I want to say, and I'd appreciate if I did it without being interrupted. So you've got the moral high ground there if you haven't interrupted them, and you certainly don't if you, of course you can correct things that people have said. You can say, look, there are a couple of things that you said there that I'd like to challenge, or there are a couple of things that you said there that I'd like to query, you see. So you can actually respond. It's just that you allow them to finish what they're saying before you respond. And by doing that, of course, you're going to have a much more constructive conversation. Here are some other things to think about in relation to these poor performance conversations that might be useful for you. A poor performance conversation is not an invitation for a full-on argument or fight. Okay? So avoid argument and avoid confrontation. The other person might perceive it to be an argument, but it's not, and nor should it be. And there are a couple of strategies that are useful for you here. If the person wants to argue with you, then just simply make the statement, I refuse to argue with you about this. Or another way around this is to say to the other person, we will just have to agree to disagree. and then you've diffused or neutralized the difference of viewpoint. Because often these things where there are differences of viewpoint are not the big picture. They're usually the nitty-gritty or things that aren't critical to the outcome. So don't argue. Secondly, it's really important for you to focus on performance. Remember, you're not attacking the person, you're talking about the performance. And if you use a critical incident, as I said earlier, you will have an opportunity to be able to focus on performance, which is critically important. Thirdly, it's important, as I mentioned earlier on in this broadcast, to focus on the future. So what I need you to do here is to focus attention on how the behaviour will change in the future. Because at the end of the day, if you want to know what the sign of a successful feedback session is, and particularly on poor performance, it is whether or not that performance has improved in the future. And the only way that it can improve in the future is if we focus on the future and we consider what might be done differently next time around. And of course, it's important for you to balance feedback up with some strengths as well as weaknesses. So at the very least, you could say to somebody, look, I'm very confident that that won't happen again. And I'm sure that you'll be able to manage that far more effectively next time. Now, that's not insincere, because if you genuinely thought that the person wasn't going to deal with it effectively in the future, then why are you giving them feedback? In other words, it's a bit phony because you don't believe in any way, shape or form that that person will improve their performance. So at the very least, you can say that I'm sure you'll be able to deal with it next time. So, and of course, there are other things that you can say that are far better around building on strengths. So avoid fighting, focus on performance, focus on the future, and emphasize and balance it up with strengths as well as weaknesses, because obviously this is a conversation on poor performance where you've got to give feedback. These aren't the easiest conversations in the world, of course, but I can tell you that it's really important that you do them. And you know what? You don't even have to do them well, but I can assure you that if you don't do them, you will not feel good about yourself. And what will happen is it'll gnaw away at you. And you're hoping through osmosis or a magic wand that people will all of a sudden improve their performance. Well, it won't happen. You actually have to draw a line in the sand and let people know what your expectations are of them and get some commitment from them that they will change that behaviour in the future. That's the bottom line. So take a deep breath and just get stuck into it, and keep in mind these key principles when you do it. And look, let's think about this for a minute. Worst case scenario, feedback doesn't go well. What have you done? What's positive about it? Well, the positive thing is that you have drawn a line in the sand. You have explained to the person that that behaviour, in your mind at least, is unacceptable. That's fine. That's a perfectly good outcome. They have to respect you for that. Now, it might have been a disaster and it mightn't have gone well, but the very least is that you've drawn a line in the sand. And that's not a bad outcome when you think about it. So make sure that you do that. And one last thing before we move on is seek out the causes. Often, you know, there are some complexity to the situations that have occurred, and sometimes you need to know what the causes are. For example, if you've got a report that's poorly written and you want to give people a bit of feedback on that, and during that feedback you find out that the person that they needed a lot of information from in another area of the business had failed to get it to you on time, which meant that you rushed it at the last minute. Okay, that might be an excuse, but it's also valid for you then to make sure that, in fact, that doesn't happen again. So you might approach somebody else in the business or the organisation and remind them that they need to honour their commitment to get that information to the person on time so that they have plenty of time to complete their component of the report. Okay, now guys, I've got a little bit of homework for you, and you'll find that after each of these 6 sessions, I'm going to give you some homework, and none of it's going to be written or theoretical or anything like that. Basically, it'll be about you doing something differently as a result of what you've learned from the information in the theme of the module. So your homework as of this afternoon, because you remember you can start today, and that's the beauty of the lunch and learn, even though it might not directly be your lunch hour, depending on where you are in Australia or overseas, you can basically start straight away. So make a commitment to give feedback 3 times a day for the next week. All right, so that's 15 bits of feedback in a working week. And I want you to start today or now, and I want you to get on with it, because the sooner you get in and do it, the better. Now, a couple of tips that might help you in this regard, because, as soon as you finish here, you might go and grab a bite to eat, and then you'll forget to do this. So what you need to do is to give yourself a little reminder every single day. So you can do all sorts of interesting things. If you've got a notice board in front of you, just put the word feedback to remind you that each day it's important to do that. If you've got a calendar, write in feedback every single day. Just put a notice in there. Put a piece of string around your finger if that's going to help. Whatever you can do to remind yourself, and you don't leave the office until you have given 3 bits of feedback. So there's a challenge for you. For some of you, you'll find that, well, I'm already doing it. Great. For some of you, that'll be hugely challenging, because you'll say, well, the reality is I don't do it. I know I should. So here's your opportunity to do it. All right. So I want you to do that. I want you to write to me via email if you want to, and let me know what impact it's had, or how you felt about it, or did you do it, the way we suggested in this module. So by all means, give me feedback on your homework, which of course is to give feedback. Now remember, another key principle around this homework is it doesn't have to be negative feedback. All right, so I'm wanting you to give any feedback. So it could be 3 positive bits of feedback each day. It doesn't really worry me. In fact, I think it's probably a good thing, good place to start, because it's obviously easy to do and painless, really. And all you've got to do is to find 3 opportunities. Now, I would say to you that if you can't find 3 positive things to give feedback about this afternoon, I have to say this to you: you're not looking very hard. There are 3 positive things going on right now in your workplace, and all you have to do is to actually find them, acknowledge them, use critical incident, and then give the feedback. It only could take 1 or 2 minutes, but it'll make all the difference, and you'll be surprised at the difference it makes. As long as it's genuine, it's specific, it's timely, and all the things that we've mentioned before, there's a very good chance that it'll go over extremely well. All right, so that's homework, guys. So if you've got any last questions, type them in now, because we're just about ready to finish. The last slide I just wanted to throw up again for you to have a look at, so that you understand where we're going in this process. So this afternoon, you will get the slides, you will get a recording of the presentation, and very soon you will get an invitation, not this afternoon, but at some point, you will get an invitation to complete what we call an influencing capabilities profile online. I'll send you a code. You go in and you complete that code, complete that profile, print it out. It'll be about 14 pages, and then of course bring it along to the next Lunch and Learn, which is in 2 weeks' time. and we sit down and I give you some feedback basically on your influencing capabilities and how you might improve your capacity to influence other people. So guys, that's pretty much it. So I'll leave it at that unless there's any other questions or any questions. And if you've got other questions, of course, you know where I am on email. Send them to me if you feel more comfortable doing that. Um, but I want to make this a little bit more interactive next time. So don't be shy. Even if you've got a statement that you want to make, it's always interesting to hear that. So I wish you all the very best with your feedback, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, guys.